Conference session called Alternative Directions, Inclusive Heritage. My name is David Maloney. I'm a planner here at the City of Ottawa within the Heritage and Urban Design Services Group. But more recently, you may know me as the conference's sponsorship coordinator, a title that will expire in just a few hours. I feel quite honored that Andre, Glenn, and Brian agreed to be part of this somewhat outside-the-box session this morning. And I'm really excited to see all of you here today to listen, maybe challenge yourself, and hopefully take part in a dynamic discussion about alternative perspectives on heritage. When the finishing touches on the session were put in place, I took a moment to look at the presentation titles and consider the content through my own lens as a municipal heritage planner, and couldn't help but ask myself, how many heritage designated properties across Ontario are there that commemorate assassins, thugs, drunkards, criminals, communists? How much ink in our various statements of significance is dedicated to socialist organizations, populist movements, political activists, the gay, lesbian, queer, and trans communities as examples? Maybe I'm being a little dramatic, but it's almost like those of us here today who chose to be in this session are the rebels of the Heritage Conference. We're doing our little part to chip away at the status quo, and choosing to focus some of our attention on groups that didn't really fit the mainstream mold, both then and now. I think that's a fun perspective to have, but in all seriousness, these presentations will cover provocative, fascinating, and very relevant subjects for all of us to consider when we think about the concept of inclusive heritage. So without further delay, I'd like to call up Andre Laflamme, and afterwards I'll call up Brian McDougall and Glenn Crawford. So Andre Laflamme is the founder and operator of Ottawa Free Tours, which provides wonderful tours of downtown Ottawa throughout the year. So if you're visiting Ottawa, you want to check in with him later. Brian McDougall is a professor of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University, and also the owner of People's History Walking Tours of Ottawa. And last but not least, we have Glenn Crawford, who's a longtime gay activist involved in the Village Legacy Project. Glenn was also the chair of the Village Committee, which convinced the City of Ottawa to officially identify our very own gay corner at Bank and Somerset Street. So thank you all again for agreeing to do this, and let's get started, shall we?
Okay, thank you everyone. My name is Andre Laflamme. Is it okay if I don't use the mic? Can everyone hear me? I have a phone call or something. So I am the owner, founder, and operator of Ottawa Free Tours. As was mentioned by David, Ottawa Free Tours is a free walking tour company of downtown Ottawa. We don't charge you anything to go on the tour. We just sort of ask for donations at the end based on what you thought that we accomplished in the last 2 hours. We're currently offering 3 different tours. One, the Capital City Tour outside Ottawa of Centertown and the Byward Market. We also offer the Ottawa Historical Tavern Tour that takes tourists and locals to 3 historical bars or bars within historical buildings in the Byward Market and sort of shares some stories about Ottawa's history over a pint of beer. And then coming in July, we're going to have the Ottawa After Dark Tour that sort of focuses on, that will start at sort of sunset and focus on some of the darker side of Ottawa's past as we take you throughout Centertown and then ending at Parliament Hill for the light show on Parliament Hill. So really exciting summer we've got going on here. But today, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the grime beneath the shine, what I like to call. Finding stories in Ottawa's history of drunkards, hooligans, and bank robbers. So I should really preface this by saying that, I'm a bit humbled, I suppose, by sharing this session with my 2 other presenters, because really they're doing really important work focusing on, obviously, areas and people that are not typically represented. Everyone I'm going to be talking to you about today in this presentation is a white male, a typically historically powerful white male as well. What I like to do, though, is I like to try to find maybe a different lens to look through their stories and find different stories of people that maybe aren't always explored in our heritage. And a really good example of this is on my next slide. This photo right here. This is a very well-known photo. Anyone that was here for the Francophone session before this would have seen this photo in that presentation. You're all history people. Can anyone tell me what this photo is here? Anyone know this photo? Just shout it
I'll
out.
get out
Charlottetown
Charlottetown Conference, right? It's a very well-known photo. We see it in textbooks, we see it in classrooms, all that. Now, I learned in high school that the Charlottetown Conference was one of 3 conferences that led to Canadian Confederation, along with Quebec City and London, where the leaders of these different British colonies came together to build a better country for all Canadians with more responsible government, more representative government for its citizens. Now, that's about a 30-second explanation of a very, very complex topic, right? And obviously, you're not going to explain the Charlottetown Conference in 30 seconds. So what I like to do is just sort of look under a different lens, find a different story within there that I can really summarize quickly, that maybe is a bit more engaging, maybe a bit more humorous, and will maybe stick with the visitors that come on my tours a bit longer than sort of the textbook version that they all heard in high school. And we can see that story. It's actually hidden within plain sight of this photo, just that most people don't realize it as often as we see this photo. If we go to my next slide, you want to click again there. So there's one individual right here in dead center in this photo. That right there, as I'm sure you all know, is Sir John A. MacDonald. Now, Sir John A. MacDonald was too brutally hungover to even stand up for his own photograph. They had to drag him out the conference center, slap a suit on him, and slump him over the steps so they could even just take this photo. That's because the Charlottetown Conference was one of the biggest benders in Canada's history. Representatives from Ontario and Quebec weren't even invited to the conference. They sort of had to crash the party of the maritime colonies that were holding a conference in Charlottetown. Now, initially, talks were not going well for the most part. People weren't seeing eye to eye, there was bickering. But the representatives of Ontario and Quebec brought with them $13,000 worth of champagne on that ship with them. That weekend, the champagne got uncorked, people started seeing a bit more eye to eye, and they managed to hammer out an agreement whereby we form a country, confederate into one country, and come together in each other's defense in case those scary Americans attacked, right? That's why Canada is sort of like many neglected children. We were conceived over a weekend of heavy, heavy drinking. Now that's just one example of a different lens through which you can look at this photo and find a different story. Is that the entire story of the Charlottetown Conference? By no means is that the entire story, but that's the story that I like to tell because everyone has heard the historical textbook story, and the story that maybe will stick with my visitors a bit longer. So what I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to explore 2 other stories that I like to tell that typically don't get a lot of coverage when you look at heritage in Ottawa. Typically, like, you don't hear about these stories, you don't hear about these people, but they're really, really compelling stories in our past. And the next one, if you want to advance the next slide, involves this individual right here. Does anyone know who that is?
Darcy McGee.
Thomas Darcy McGee. Now, I'm not going to talk about the assassination of Thomas Darcy McGee. We all know that story. We all know that Thomas Darcy McGee was the only Canadian federal politician to be assassinated while still in office. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to talk about Thomas Darcy McGee's nephew. You skipped ahead, man. Oh. Ruined the surprise. Thomas Darcy McGee's nephew, Frank McGee, who was famous for the same thing that most Canadians are famous for today. He was, of course, a hockey player, right? Frank McGee, he's the guy right there in the top left of the screen. Now, Frank McGee was the Ottawa Silver Seven's best hockey player. At the turn of the century, the Ottawa Silver Seven were the dominant team in the National Hockey League. They were the Stanley Cup champions. They really dominated, much like today, right? Just like today, Ottawa dominates them. Now, in but they had this really complex and advanced system of tactics that still baffle coaches today, and people still study them and to learn from them. Basically, what they would do is they would blatantly injure everyone else on the other team and then let Frank McGee go and score goals, right? In fact, I'm going to make the argument for you right now that these are the 7 biggest jerks in all of Canada's history. And there's no better story that I could tell you to illustrate this than to tell you the story of the Dawson City Challenge. So in 1905, the Ottawa Silver Seven were still the Stanley Cup champions, and they were challenged by the Dawson City Golden Nuggets. We'll go to the next slide. There's the Dawson City Golden Nuggets. Now, back then, the Stanley Cup was a challenge cup. That means it was like a boxing title, so there was a champion, they were challenged by a contender, they had a series, and the winner of that series came out as the new Stanley Cup champion. Well, in 1905, the Dawson City Golden Nuggets were doing pretty well. They had 2 ex-players from Montreal, 1 ex-player from Ottawa. They were winning a lot of games out there on the West Coast. But they suffered from one very serious problem. And that problem was that they lived in Dawson City, Yukon, and they had to make it all the way to Ottawa using 1905 transportation networks for their series. So if you want to go to the next slide, here is a map of Canada, right? And just to put it in some perspective, if you want to go to the next slide, that's Dawson City, That's Ottawa. So I'm going to walk you through the game plan, how they were planning to get here. You want to go to the next slide? So first they were going to do 500 miles via dog sled to Whitehorse, Yukon. Next slide. Take a train to Skagway, Alaska. Next slide. Steamer down the coast to Vancouver. Next slide. And then finally this long cross-country train ride all the way to Ottawa. The whole thing was going to take them about 2 weeks, and they were going to arrive about 2 weeks before their first match. Now from the get-go, things did not go well. When they set out on dog sleds, their trip was bogged down with this mild weather. They were bogged down in slush and mud because this unexpected warm weather set in. Once they reached Whitehorse after being delayed a few days, in Whitehorse this deep freeze set in and their train was delayed even further. Once they finally got to Skagway, Alaska and got on that steamer, it was said to be the roughest ride in the history of seafaring. The entire team got violently seasick. Once they finally reached Vancouver, it was too foggy to dock. They had to get redirected down to Seattle, where they finally got on a train and then made it to Vancouver and took this long cross-country train ride all the way to Ottawa in these cramped conditions, all their equipment. Finally arriving in Ottawa 2 days before their first match. Now, despite this monumental journey, and despite the fact that their best player actually didn't make it on time because he was traveling separately, the Ottawa Silver Seven flat out refused to delay the first match by even a single day. Well, as you might imagine, in that first match, the Ottawa Silver Seven trounced Dawson City, right? We beat them 9-2, right? Because they were all tired, they were so exhausted from this trip. But you know what? This is the part of the movie where this young team of whippersnappers rises up and shows these giant jerks what's what, right? Well, in the second game of the best-of-3 series, the Ottawa Silver Seven beat the Dawson City Golden Nuggets by a score of 23-2, the most lopsided score in all of Stanley Cup history. The Ottawa Silver Seven then proceeded to get blackout drunk, and they attempted to drop-kick the Stanley Cup across the Riel Canal. Now, for the record, in case there's a record out there, it didn't make it. It didn't make it all the way. It landed on the ice, they left it there overnight, no big deal. They went and got it the next morning, no worse for wear. The Dawson City Golden Nuggets then had to start their long trip all the way home, having accomplished absolutely nothing at the hands of the 7 biggest jerks in Ottawa's history, right there. Our pride and joy, the Dawson City, or the Ottawa Silver Seven. Now that is an extremely compelling story that I just never even heard of for the longest time. I was operating this tour company for over a year before I even got a glimpse of this story. And it wasn't until then that I really got to explore it a bit more and find a compelling story behind this photograph that we know so well. If anyone's ever been to Elgin and Spark Street, where they're going to be building the monument to the Stanley Cup, the conception of the Stanley Cup, right across from what was the Russell House Hotel, there's a big picture of them right there. There's no explanation about this story because we like to hide that past in Ottawa sometimes, I find. I've got another story for you, but before I do, maybe I'll just take questions at the end if that's okay. Yeah. Before I do, I just want to make sure I get enough time to get these stories in. To sort of segue to the next story, I'm just going to show you a few photographs. So if you want to the next slide. Can anyone tell me who that is? Does anyone know who that is? That is Bonnie and Clyde, that's right. Very famous bank robbing duo, right? Part of Americana, really well known. They have their own museum. They have their own movie, of course, with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. Really well-known group of bank robbers. Next slide. Anyone know who that is?
John Dillinger.
John Dillinger, right? Also a very famous bank robber. Everyone knows that name. He has his own movie, of course, as well. If you want to advance, he had that movie most recently with Johnny Depp, but a lot of different movies. He has his own museums in the U.S. Really part of Americana. Next slide. Does anyone know who that is? No? No one? Okay, so they are bank robbers. They are 2 parts of a 3-part bank robbing trio that were arguably more prolific, more successful, and had a more compelling story than either of the 2 that I just told you. What if I told you that they were from right here in Ottawa and no one, or very few people, have ever heard of them? I'm talking, of course, of the Stopwatch Gang. The Stopwatch Gang were these 2 men here, Paddy Mitchell and Stephen Reed, along with Lionel Wright. Now, they had their own movie, if you want to advance to the next slide. Just most people don't realize it. Has anyone heard of this movie, Point Break, with Patrick Swayze and Keanu Reeves? It was a movie about some surfer bank robbers who would rob banks. They'd be in and out of the banks in 90 seconds flat. And they'd rob them wearing masks of dead presidents, most famously, right? Well, those bank robbers were actually based on the Stopwatch Gang that was from right here in Ottawa that for one reason or another, we just don't represent in our heritage. So I'm going to tell you the story to prove to you how compelling the story of these 3 men were. You guys, there they are. They're the three men. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to get pictures of Lionel Wright. He was known as the ghost of Millhaven because he's so difficult to pin down. He was known as an individual that could be in a room for the entire night. No one would even realize he was there. So that's the best photo we have that I'm aware of. But the Stopwatch Gang. So they initially came together right here in Ottawa, and they pioneered a lot of the things that I mentioned in the earlier slide when I was talking about Point Break. They're known as the Stopwatch Gang because often Stephen Reed would rob a bank wearing a stopwatch. He wanted to make sure they were in and out in 100 seconds flat. They would also rob banks wearing these crazy Halloween masks. And that was because they realized that if you rob a bank wearing a ski mask, witnesses would maybe remember that, oh, he was tall, he had a scar. If you rob a bank wearing a crazy mask, all any witness is going to be able to describe to the police was the mask, which is totally useless to the police afterwards. In fact, Stephen Reed would famously rob a number of banks with a banana hanging out of his pocket. He would always amuse himself the next day reading the newspaper stories where witnesses were describing the man with the banana hanging out of his pocket. Well, how is that going to help the police at the end of the day, right? He's walking around with a banana hanging out of his pocket. Now, one of their most prolific jobs was right here in Ottawa, and that was the heist, the gold bar heist from the Ottawa airport. So in the 1970s, the Ottawa airport would frequently receive shipments of gold from different gold mines across Canada. And in 1974, they got these three men received an inside tip from their inside man at the Ottawa airport that a large shipment of gold was going to be coming in to the airport in Ottawa to be held for a few days before being transported to the mint down Sussex Street so it could be minted into gold bars. So when they heard this was coming, they hopped into their car and they drove down to the Ottawa airport. Stephen Reed, wearing the uniform of an airport worker, got himself into the cargo bay, talked to the security guard, and convinced him to walk away from the cargo hold. He then pulled a gun on him, tied him up, and put a cardboard box over his head. They then loaded all the gold onto their car and made a getaway. With $700,000 in gold bars in 1974 dollars, that would be worth over $8 million today. At least, that's what we thought they did. In the early 2000s, Paddy Mitchell, who I should say was known to exaggerate and make things up, but still, Paddy Mitchell, in the early 2000s, wrote an article for the Ottawa Citizen, where he claimed that what they actually did was they tied the security guard, put a cardboard box over his head, moved all the gold from the holding area to the general cargo area, relabeled it for their safe house in Windsor, and the authorities shipped it directly to them. Now, unfortunately, these three men were actually caught in that heist. Their inside man at the Ottawa airport turned on them, and they all did eventually go to jail for it. But that was not the end of their story. They all have extremely compelling escape stories. Lionel Wright, the ghost as he was known back then, was being held in an Ottawa detention center. One day he was walking around the yard. When a car pulled up to the fence, they pulled a gun on the security guard and disarmed him, the man in the car, threw a bunch of wire cutters over the fence wall, and a bunch of convicts then started snipping the wire cutters and getting into the car of their accomplice. Lionel Wright just followed them directly into the car. They were a few miles down the road before they even realized there was a man in their car who wasn't part of the gang. They kicked Lionel Wright out, and that's a good thing, because that entire car of convicts later got recaptured, whereas Lionel Wright had made a beeline down to Florida, where he was freed from prison and escaped to the US. Paddy Mitchell and Stephen Reed were being held at the Millhaven Correctional Facility, just outside of Kingston. Now, Stephen Reed faked an interest in hairstyling, and this interest got him a bit ingratiated to the warden as someone who was trying to rehabilitate himself and find a career after he was out of prison. And one day he was granted a day pass to go visit a local hairstylist to learn a bit. He had to go to the washroom, hopped out a window, made a beeline for it, and got out of there, escaping from prison. You think those two are good though? Wait until you hear about Paddy Mitchell's escape. That's the one that's the pièce de résistance. Paddy Mitchell and Millhaven, they would get rations of tobacco. And over a number of days, Paddy Mitchell saved up his tobacco. One morning, he put it all in his water glass, and he filled up his water glass with water. He then went jogging in the yard. He got back to his cell at the end of about 5 miles of jogging, and he pounded that glass of water, giving himself a mild heart attack. He was then thrown into an ambulance along with 2 unarmed guards and rushed directly for the hospital. When they reached the hospital, there was a sign out front saying that the main entrance was closed and to go around to the back. When the ambulance got around to the back, they were greeted by 2 paramedics, and when they opened up the ambulance to transport Paddy Mitchell into the hospital, those 2 paramedics pulled guns on them. Any guesses who those 2 paramedics were? They were, of course, Stephen Reed and an accomplice. They threw Paddy Mitchell on a gurney, got him into a car, and got him to a safe house, and got him to vomit up all the gross stuff that he had actually consumed there with that water, saving his life, stabilizing him, and then starting their crazy spree of bank robberies all throughout the US. They had the record for the largest bank robbery in California's history for a number of years, and they still have the record for the largest bank robbery in the history of San Diego, the city of San Diego, the Bank of America branch there. Three of the most prolific bank robbers in the history of the US, more successful by monetary value than any of the people that I mentioned at the start of this. Yet we know nothing about them in the city. They're not celebrated. I never saw a single plaque to them. I never saw anything. This is an extremely compelling story, and we should have museums to these people. We should be celebrating this part of our heritage, because despite the fact that it's seedy and it's underground, this is very compelling heritage and something that we should be celebrating as a city. I suppose it's to my benefit that we don't, because then I get to take advantage of it with my free tours. If you want to go to the next slide there. With that, that's sort of the end of my presentation. I'm just about out of time there anyway, but I am, of course, happy to take any questions that you guys have. There's one earlier there, yeah.
So you mentioned the second game that the Civil 7 won against Dawson.
Yeah.
Was that the game where Paddy McGee scored 14 goals?
That was the game where he scored 14 goals, that's right.
And was he already known as Eyed McGee by then?
Yeah, so he always had one eye whenever he played hockey throughout his entire career as a hockey player. Really notable because it's crazy that you could score that many goals while with one eye. And his career was very short actually, because he later joined the forces and went to the First World War. So he retired from hockey still in his 20s, I
And
believe.
he died in 1916 at the start.
Well, there you go. Any other questions? No, those really crazy stories, no questions? Yeah.
All right. Well, how do you come up with these crazy stories?
So how do I come up with these crazy stories? That's a great question. Honestly, this is going to sound really bad in a room full of history people. Wikipedia is a great starting point. Starting point. No, if it wasn't for Wikipedia, I would have never gotten a whiff of these two. Once you find out about them, you go down a Wikipedia hole, like I like to call it. I go to the Ottawa room at the Ottawa Library. I talk to my good friend James, who does the, oh, you should all know about this. There's a really great blog, a WordPress blog, done by a local resident called Today in Ottawa's History. And he does a different article for every single day of the calendar in Ottawa's history. And he's got a ton of fantastic stories there. In fact, what I do sometimes, probably don't tell James this, but what I do sometimes is I email James like, hey, I just heard about this story. You should really write a blog on it. I wait for him to write his blog, and then I can use a lot of that content. But the Ottawa room at the Ottawa Library, if you want to know more about the Stopwatch Gang, there's a really, really great article in the Atavist. The Atavist is an online magazine. They do really in-depth stories on a few different, like one topic per month, and they even have an audiobook version of it. It's a really, really long story, but it's extremely compelling. I definitely recommend it. Any other questions? No? Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will probably start here and walk around. My name is Brian McDougall, and I am associated with, and in fact the owner of, People's History Walking Tours. I want to start by thanking David for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to be here. And I also want to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory. Nobody has ever signed a treaty with the Algonquin regarding the land that we are on. They regard it as theirs. I do too, which is part of the reason why I'm wearing a t-shirt that says, not Canada 150, but colonialism 150. And I'll come back to say a little more about that later on. The photo that you see here is a demonstration that occurred at the closing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in 2016. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm a former university teacher. Currently I'm an adjunct in Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University. But I'm also a former public servant and a lifelong socialist and political activist around the city. And that partly explains some of the take that I'm going to present on heritage issues in the next little while. So I'm not primarily concerned with buildings in the work that I do as a tour guide. I'm more interested in people and their stories. And I focus specifically on, not on the elite of Canadian society or of Ottawa society, not the politicians and the wealthy folks, but rather on the common people. And so in Ottawa, there are a lot of tours which you can do that are official tours on Parliament Hill, the East Block, and so on. And there are a lot of privately run tours which are very heavily influenced by the official narrative about the history of Ottawa, the history of Canada, and so on. I seek to oppose those official narratives. Go ahead. So there is a copy of my brochure over on the table there if you want to pick it up later on. It will give you some detailed information about the tours that I do. I currently offer 5 tours. Short titles are there for 4 of them. There's a 5th one which deals with the Chaudière district. And I have another new tour planned for next year. But I won't go into the details of my tours, except to say that I am trying with the tours to both offer an account of, an alternative account of the experience of people who've lived in this city. But at the same time, I'm trying to encourage people to learn more about history for the purposes of being politically active. That is to say, I'm encouraging people to try to play a role in history. So in that sense, my tours are part instruction and part provocation. So my clientele, as you can imagine, is quite varied. I do about half of my tours for people from outside of the city and half of my tours for people who reside here. And that includes people who are members of trade unions, student groups, and other kinds of organizations that have an interest both in understanding history better, but also in trying to influence it. And lately, the last couple of years, so I started this business 3 years ago when I retired from the federal public service. In the last couple of years, the main issues that are motivating people to take my tours are, first of all, the global recession that occurred in 2008, 2009. Secondly, the shocking revelations, shocking to most Canadians because they don't know the history, the shocking revelations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. More recently, obviously, the election of Donald Trump, which has surprised a lot of people and scared a lot of people, quite rightly. And related to that, the general political turmoil that has seen huge votes for Le Pen in France, Mélenchon in France, Bernie Sanders in the USA, and of course, just in the past week, Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. So very quickly, a couple of stories. I won't tell too many stories here because I actually want to get on to other things. But just to give you a sense of the kind of thing that I'm talking about during my tours, this is a well-known building, the East Block of the Parliament buildings. And I can't get into the whole story about how that building was constructed and some of the difficulties associated with it because we don't have time. But suffice it to say that during the building process from 1859 to 1865, in particular for this building, there was dramatic problems with the construction. Cost overruns, design problems, and so on. The problems were so severe that in 1862 construction stopped for a little over 18 months while there was a royal commission to inquire into what the hell the problems were with all of the 3 buildings that were being put up on Parliament Hill. Anyway, they got back to work and the building was finally completed, this one in 1865. During the construction process, the company that had the contract for what were known as the two departmental buildings, East Block and West Block, a company by the name of Jones and Haycock, decided that one of the things they would do to try to cut costs was to use locally sourced sand for the mortar and the cement that they were using to construct the building. So they took the sand from a sandbank, which no longer exists, right over in front of what is today the Canadian Museum of History. Okay? That sandbank had been investigated in previous decades by a Dr. Edward Van Cortlandt, a medical doctor here in Ottawa, who is an amateur archaeologist. He established that that sandbank had traditionally been used as an Indigenous burial ground. So the old saying that Canada is built on stolen Indigenous land, absolutely true, but it's also the case that Canada's capital's buildings, the Parliament buildings, are quite likely built with Indigenous bones. And I think that that kind of puts into perspective some of the issues around the relationship between Indigenous people and the Government of Canada, particularly when you know that this is the building, actually right up here on the second floor, on the other side of the corridor, that is the place where the policy of residential schools and the Indian Act were designed and then subsequently adopted. Go ahead. This is a statue which you can see by going out of this building and walking to your right for about a minute and a half. It's a statue that stands in front of the Cartier Drill Hall. And it is a statue that commemorates the two Ottawa soldiers who died at the Battle of Cut Knife Hill in 1885 while suppressing the Métis Provisional Government in Saskatchewan. And it is a statue that, of course, is in front of the Cartier Drill Hall because that is the headquarters of the Governor General's Foot Guards, which is where these two soldiers came from. Now, up until very recently, this was, and it is today still in many important ways, the only kind of commemorative representation of anything to do with Métis national history in Canada's capital. There is no statue of Louis Riel, there's no memorial to the provisional government, there's nothing at all like that. This stands as the only way in which the Government of Canada still officially commemorates the Métis national struggle back in the 1880s. And that despite the fact that in 1982, when the Constitution was redone, the Métis were recognized as Aboriginal peoples, despite the fact that in 2007, when CBC ran a contest to identify the greatest Canadians, Louis Riel came out number 11 on that list, and there were 1.2 million people involved in voting on that. So this, I think, illustrates one of the problems that we have with official history in the city. Let's skip the next two slides. So I'm skipping 2 slides about the current controversy over the construction of the ZB condos on the Chaudière Islands, because I want to get into the next section. So when we look at the heritage industry in Canada, and you're all experts in the area, so you know far more about it than I do. Broadly speaking, we can see organizations that are governmental, private sector, non-governmental, and so on. But in Ottawa, it is, of course, the federal government that sets the standard for most of what happens with respect to heritage stuff. So what I'm going to suggest is that most of the heritage activity is essentially defined by government and corporate interests, the interests of the 1%. And that means that the heritage activity that goes on is often geared towards trying to support or encourage nation building. It's preoccupied with strengthening citizenship. It's directed towards promoting and encouraging imagined community. And it essentially encourages people, it has underlying it a kind of a pedagogical model that encourages people to be the passive consumers of the expert knowledge of people in the heritage industry. Go ahead. And of course in Ottawa we have the massive federal presence of government heritage. And there's a long list of government departments that are involved directly in the heritage business. Canadian Heritage, NCC, Parks Canada, Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, et cetera, et cetera. Massive apparatus. We also have a massive apparatus of museums. And then we have organizations like the Parliament of Canada with their official tours and their course outlines for teachers and so on. In other words, a huge apparatus. Keep going. Let's skip that one. I was going to say a few things about Canada 150, but I will only mention that they are spending $610 million, an amount that could probably make a serious dent in dealing with the predicament of the 85 First Nations across Canada who are still facing boiled water advisories. If we look at the evolution of heritage policy in Canada, I think we can distinguish between 4 different periods, and this is going to bring me to the conclusion. So prior to World War I, it was pretty much laissez-faire. The government of Canada was not heavily involved in the heritage business. That shifts when we get to World War II. And it shifts for a number of reasons. Firstly, it shifts, I would suggest, because the government of Canada is involved in a war and it sees Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia both relying very heavily on state propaganda to mobilize their populations. Secondly, it becomes evident during World War II that the state has to step in and intervene in the economy to create a command economy that can satisfy the need for prosecuting the war. And then, of course, after the war, there are incredible anxieties in ruling circles about the possibility that what happened after World War I, the 1919 general strike in Winnipeg, the depression of the 1930s and so on, there were serious fears that that kind of thing could occur once again after World War II. And so in the aftermath of World War II, we see the construction of Keynesianism, the beginning of a welfare state, a new kind of arrangement between capital and labor and so on, all of which creates profoundly new conditions for the Canadian state, conditions in which they have to get seriously into the heritage business in order to promote ideologically a kind of identification and commitment with Canada Inc. In order to maintain social control. Go ahead. So that's the kind of period that we see from the late 1940s through until about 1980. The period of Keynesianism, the growing welfare state, and so on. And it's characterized by all kinds of heritage initiatives. The Massey Royal Commission in 1951, the construction of all kinds of new institutions of culture and heritage by the Canadian state, expansion of public archives, the National Library, CBC TV, the National Film Board, et cetera, et cetera. Very long list of initiatives. It includes Expo 67, the celebration of Confederation in 1967, and so on. All kinds of efforts that are designed, especially as we get into the late 60s and 1970s, to counter the growing unrest at the base of society. Nationalism in Quebec, the growth of radicalism in the labor movement, an anti-war movement, women's movements, gay and lesbian movement, etc. Go ahead. And that leads to the third period, which is the one that starts roughly about 1980 and continues up until 2008, the period of neoliberalism. And in the period of neoliberalism, we see, quite apart from how the state handles all of those social movements and all that pressure from below, particularly the attack on the labor movement, but also efforts to co-opt indigenous rights activists and other kinds of social movements. What we see through the period of neoliberalism is a shift in the strategy of the Canadian state with respect to heritage, so that now heritage has to start to pay for itself. Privatization, commodification of things, deals with the private sector, and so on. And they even at one point in 1976 decide they're going to get out of the business of, for example, holding Canada Day celebrations. So in 1976, no Canada Day. But a couple of months later, the PQ elected their first government in Quebec, and by the next year, bang, Canada Day celebrations were on bigger and better than ever with a bigger budget and a more political agenda. Okay? So that's the period that leads up until 2008. Yep, thanks. And in 2008, we see 2008, 2009 financial crisis, and a crisis that begins the period that we are in right now. And it's a period characterized by the rebirth of all kinds of social movements and social protest. Occupy, the Arab Spring revolutions, the Maple Spring in Quebec, Idle No More, Black Lives Matter, etc., etc. All kinds of unrest bubbling to the top of society. And most economists will tell you that the economic crisis of 2008, 2009 has not been rectified in the sense that the global economy has not recovered its previous dynamism. And so we see more recently, the last 2 years, now the other shoe dropping. We had the economic crisis, now we have the political crisis that is connected with it. And that is why we see Le Pen, Trump, the growth of fascism in a variety of countries, including Canada. I was involved in anti-fascist work in Ottawa in the 1980s. In the last couple of months, we've suddenly seen fascists back on our streets in this city. So we're starting to see that kind of political stuff happening on the right, and I've already mentioned some of the examples of stuff on the left. So what does all of this mean for folks in the heritage industry? I think we have to recognize that much of what exists in the heritage industry today presupposes the neoliberal period and reality from roughly 1980 to about 2008. Neoliberalism is gone. That period is over. We are in a different stage of history now. And that has implications for everybody, including folks in the heritage industry. Firstly, I think you're going to see very changing demands from governments and other funders about what it is they expect from you. Secondly, you're going to see increased criticism from social movements from below about what heritage should be, what it should mean, whose interests it should serve, and so on. And thirdly, I think you're going to see all kinds of new initiatives with respect to heritage, initiatives that I would characterize as heritage from below. And I'm pretty much out of time, so I'll just show you one or two examples and then wrap up. So let's go on to the next one. There we go. So there's an example here in Ottawa, and this is an event, kind of a process that occurred, culminating in an event in 2013. And the two people in the photo are Kevin Dooley, who's the sort of lead organizer of the Canal Workers Commemorative Group here in Ottawa, and that's his wife. and their picture was being taken next to a plaque that the government of Canada was forced through public pressure to place by the Rideau Canal. After all of the foo-for-ah in which the government of Canada won UNESCO World Heritage designation for the canal, there was a campaign by the canal commemorative workers to say, you know, the designation only talks about the engineering and the elite, the people who organized the project. It says nothing about the 1,000 people who died actually constructing the damn thing. And then they got into Kevin and his associates got into a public debate with Heritage Canada and its minister of the time, Peter Kent, which Peter Kent lost. And he was forced to go and put up this very nice plaque, which actually commemorates the role of the workers. So that's one example. One more quick one. The guy on the left, Dr. Peter Bryce, was a federal public servant who blew the whistle on the residential school system in the period just before World War I. But the government, the public servants, the government officials, and the politicians of the time were committed to the residential school system, even though Bryce documented the fact that it was killing at least a quarter of the kids who were in the school system at the time. And so he was eventually squeezed out of the public service, but when he left the public service in 1922, he took the results of his research and published a book, which documented what was going on with the residential school system. Didn't change anything. The residential school system wasn't dismantled finally. The last school was closed in 1996. But nevertheless, Peter Bryce is an example of a public servant who went against the interests of the 1% and lost the battle, but is today commemorated. And if you look over on the right-hand side, that's a picture of Cindy Blackstock and some of her associates from the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, who had a plaque placed beside Peter Bryce's tombstone in Beechwood Cemetery, commemorating his role in opposing the residential school system. And of course, if you're following politics these days, you may know that Cindy Blackstock herself has been the lead in an ongoing battle with the government of Canada about funding for Indigenous children. And in 2016, January 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found the government of Canada guilty of racist discrimination against Indigenous children for underfunding services for them on reserve. And they have now, the government of Canada has now been issued, just last month, its third compliance order because it has refused to comply with Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Skip the next slide. Just to conclude, one of my favorite writers, George Orwell. Of course, Orwell was a socialist and a critic of Stalin's Russia as well as Hitler's Germany. That's what those books, Animal Farm and 1984, are all about. And Orwell understood that there was a connection between the ability of the elite to run society today and the way in which they interpreted and presented the past. And he understood also that our understanding of the past and our interpretation of it played a very serious role in terms of our ability to conceive of alternatives for the future, either limiting them or expanding our understanding of the future. So just to conclude, I think heritage organizations in the period that we're in, the period of anti-Trump policies and politics, can expect a lot more opposition and criticism for the work that they do. You can expect to see a lot more heritage from below kinds of initiatives, more radical initiatives, and more pressure to reach out to dissidents within our society. So prepare yourselves, and for those of you in the audience who are lefties or inclined towards that end of the political spectrum, you might want to think about linking up and cooperating and reaching out to some of the dissident social movements in your communities, and supporting some of the interesting and provocative Heritage from Below initiatives that they might be sponsoring. Thank you.
If you have any questions, maybe we can take a couple questions and we'll still be relatively on time for lunch. I know there's one more presenter. Any questions?
You talk about heritage from below, and you talk about the left driving a lot of this. Are you worried about a backlash against that and other, like you're saying, like the Sons of Odin coming in and having their own pressure on government to have whatever they believe needs to be represented? Like, you're framing it very much, it's only coming from one side, but are you worried that that won't be the case?
So the consensus that has governed our societies from 1980 to 2008, which is a consensus that has been adopted pretty much by all political parties, Tories, Liberals, NDP, they've all bought into the neoliberal ethos. Make the market stronger, buy onto globalization and so on. That central preoccupation is collapsing. And as it collapses, you're finding people moving to the left and moving to the right. Okay? Nothing I say or do will change that reality. It is a product, firstly, of the failure of the economy in 2008, 2009, and of the lingering effects of neoliberalism, which has been about creating more inequality, making us feel more insecure, right? I mean, part of the solution that the governments of the world had to the unrest of the Keynesian period was to make us feel more insecure so we would stop creating difficulty for them. That means, you know, more job instability, fewer social programs, it means higher levels of debt, all of the kinds of things that are supposed to prevent us from protesting. That strategy is now imploding. And as it implodes, you get Trump and Sanders, right? You get Corbyn, you get Mélenchon, you get Le Pen, you get the Sons of Odin, and you will get Black Lives Matter. Okay? There's no going back and recreating neoliberalism, because like all other sorts of strategies within a capitalist society, it will work for a period of time, and then when it collapses, it needs to be replaced by something else. And the economists and the politicians do not have a new version of neoliberalism on offer, which is why we see Trump on the one hand, and why we see Sanders on the other hand. It's interesting that, I mean, if you're looking at the future of heritage, look at what the pollsters tell us about who supported Sanders and who supported Corbyn and who supported Mélenchon. Okay? If you look at people ages 18 to 25, 18 to 30, they are overwhelmingly on the left and on the side of serious social change. The system is not working for them, and the system is imploding. So we will see more fascists on the streets, not because I'm outspoken or because there are more people on my tours or anything else, but because the reality is that as the status quo politically and economically implodes, people start to look for other ways of making sense of the world and other ways of changing the world. And there is an audience out there for the ideas of, you know, for racist ideas, for ideas about scapegoating, for ideas about opposing immigrants, building walls, protectionism, scapegoating. There's an audience for that.
I just wanted to say thank you, well, thanks for an excellent presentation, but also thanks for talking about Peter Bryce. I work for the National Capital Commission, and I think there's quite a few people here who are civil servants, as well as people who are activists, as well as people who are working for NGOs. And I think one thing that your talk comes out as saying is I think there's a role for everyone in helping to bring progressive ideas into the discourse around heritage. And I think as civil servants, or as activists, or as people working in the heritage community more broadly, it's interesting. I think everyone has a role to play in that, and we can kind of work in different ways to bring voices that aren't being heard to the table. So anyway, thank you for your presentation. This was really excellent.
I bet there's a few people who are going to want to chat with you. Okay, well, we might have time for one more quick question.
Yeah,
And a quick answer, maybe?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Go ahead.
that's okay. I was kind of interested. What were you going to say about Sibby? I'm interested to hear your take
What
on
was it?
that.
the same question.
Yeah.
I'll give you a 30-second response now, and if anybody wants to talk about it at lunch, I'm happy to do so. Among other things, I've been involved in working in solidarity with the Algonquin in opposition to the ZB development. As you may or may not know, the Chaudière Islands and the Chaudière Falls and the surrounding territory have always been regarded by the Algonquin as a sacred site. It is their heritage. For many, many decades, from the Grevere Report in 1950 through until the reign of King Stephen Harper, it was understood that when the last industry closed, the last factory closed, that the islands would be returned to a state of nature, and that the Algonquin would play a very important role in terms of governing what happened on those islands. But Stephen Harper and John Baird did not want an increased indigenous presence in the center of their capital, and so they nixed that and decided that the islands would be converted into condos instead. But there's a longer story, which I'm happy to talk about over lunch. Thank you.
We'll get right into the last presentation here, so I'll call Glenn Crawford. We still have a good half hour.
That's good. Yeah, sure. Thanks again for everyone coming out today and listening to our presentations, and thank you to the Ontario Heritage Conference as well. My name, as you said, is Glenn Crawford. I'm working on a project called the Village Legacy Project, and it's what we're doing is funded through the City of Ottawa. We're researching and documenting LGBT history in Ottawa, and we're going to be producing a mobile app which will guide people through the Bank Street area, as well as having some public art on display, and we're hoping to have that launched by Pride this year, which is in late August. So I'm going to be talking about cruising, carousing, and rabble-rousing in the National Capital. So we'll just sort of get a brief introduction. Ottawa is a bit of a unique city in compared to other cities of its size or larger, in that we've largely been transient or migratory. A lot of other areas have had concentrated villages. We haven't really established that until very recently. And in part that's because of the culture of fear that was created by the RCMP and the government in the 50s and 60s during sort of the Cold War era, where people were basically being witch hunted in government jobs. They were deemed security risks, and as such, they were, if they were discovered, they were fired. And this fruit machine that there's a sample of in the War Museum, it was developed to help identify gays. And the machine, of course, is kind of ludicrous. It didn't really work. But it was estimated that about 100 people were fired from their job in the government because of these witch hunts. And so what that meant for Ottawa queers in particular were we were even more reluctant to come out. And also to other cities like Montreal and Toronto, it's kind of a, what happens in Montreal stays in Montreal situation. So our community in general in Ottawa was reluctant to kind of take root. And as I say, we didn't really have a village until we created one in 2011. So I'll talk a little bit about cruising, which basically was a lot of people's only option if they wanted to meet people, either romantically, sexually, or otherwise. And the risks of being LGBT before 1971, basically, it was literally you could be arrested for having consensual gay sex. And Everett George Clippert was the last case of somebody who was jailed in basically 50 years ago before this. People could be, as I say, jailed, they could be given reparative therapy, they could lose their job or their family if they were outed. If you were a youth, you could be disowned, thrown out of your homes. We still have a highly disproportionate representation of people who are homeless. Married adults who would be living double lives would likely to lose access to their children. Few people, if they were actually in a gay or lesbian relationship, they would not likely be very out because their landlords could kick them out of their home. And we were also really targeted quite heavily, particularly gay men, in hate crimes and assaults and murders as well. And typically the police were not very friendly towards us. So in 1967, there weren't gay bars, there weren't political or community organizations or safe spaces. So we're literally talking a period of about 50 years where we've gone to completely underground, hidden, terrified, and isolated to where we are now. And this meant that there were few options, if any, for people to meet anybody else. So, as I say, you would have this incredible sense of isolation. You would have no way to try and find other people. So it left you both fearful and isolated. And sometimes this resulted in people fleeing to larger cities, such as New York or San Francisco, where it was widely known to be more sexually and liberally oriented, but it could also, people could have destructive behavior such as taking drugs, alcohol, and possibly suicide. So how did people meet in this kind of culture of like underground identity? There was some literature, but it was typically, often gay literature would be very moralizing. The person, the hero would usually die at the end. So you kind of had to rely a bit on hearsay and rumor and innuendo about trying to find any place that was sort of gay friendly. You might approach people on the street, what's sort of called gaydar now. Oh, they're dressed a certain way or they act a certain way, perhaps they might also be part of the family, and so you might try to approach them on the street. But of course, if they were wrong, they could be potentially arrested or bashed. So even if people knew where gay-friendly bars were, people often didn't go to them because they were afraid of being recognized either outside or in them. You could be assaulted either entering or leaving. There are many stories of people who were pelted by eggs or physically attacked, or there were often police raids as well. So one of the few options that were left specifically for gay men who were closeted and wished to remain so was to cruise in sort of parks, public places, and as I say, women unfortunately didn't even have this option to meet people. So I list a few of the cruising hotspots. Some of these might be a little shocking or surprising to you, but they were hotbeds of action when the night fell. And I won't list them all, and there's a second page as well. This is just an example. We were pretty resourceful, I think. I think if there was a place where there was some potential privacy, and as I say, because there was nothing else, this was a way that they could meet people. So the risks involved, it could lead to empowerment or liberation, like finally you found somebody who's of your identity, so that must be incredibly liberating. But it could also, because it was fleeting, you could remain feeling isolated, and you could also potentially feel guilty and ashamed that you're doing this. And also, of course, once the place was known, it would also attract the police, who would try to entrap and arrest you, and also youth might wish to assault you as well. In particular, there was a significant murder spree that happened in 1989, again, not that long ago. Between February and August, there were at least 15 reported incidents of violence in Majors Hill Park. 7 people were thrown off the cliff, 2 of whom died, and another man was thrown off the cliff 2 years earlier to his death. 6 others were robbed, and as I say, many people might not have even reported it because the police were unsympathetic. They might actually be humiliated or otherwise. On the night of August 21st and 22nd, there was a particular set of incidents that happened that really kind of finally sort of awoke the police that there was something serious going on here. First, they murdered Eyed McGee, and he was a worker at the Chateau Laurier. He was actually straight, but he was presumed gay because he was wearing, I guess, interesting shoes. Not perhaps like mine. And they dangled him off the Alexandra Bridge and yelled, "May shoes blank," and they dropped him into the river to his death. Later that night, they weren't finished. They decided to travel to the home of Alain Fortin and Wilfred Gauthier. They lived in Orleans. One of them, this group of individuals, they had mugged a short time ago. And they broke into their home and stabbed them repeatedly. One man across the throat and another in the hand and eye. And typically, this is actually fairly common. You know, assaults happen to a large group of individuals, but LGBT people tend to be more viciously attacked and more in like mutilation of our bodies. One of the men was also dragged and placed into the car, but they weren't able to start it, and who knows what they were intending to do with the body in that process. So, as I say, this night of terror kind of finally sort of woke the police that something was going on, and our community was fed up with police inaction. So we began to work together to stop the hate crimes. And while cruising still does take place, it's greatly diminished as more and more people are coming out, more gay bars became popular, and as I say, some people do it for the thrill, or of course because we're a city where there's a lot of different types of ethnicities. Some cultures are less accepting of gay people, so they remain closeted, and so this behavior still sort of exists. So we're going to get into carousing, which is really kind of the start of bar culture. So bar culture became an important way to socialize. You could also meet people, perhaps romantically and sexually, which again maybe takes away the immediate need for cruising. And you could also mobilize politically as well. So spaces that were places, if they were open, again, there weren't specifically gay bars. We kind of found our own spaces initially. But you know, if they closed, some examples were the Honeydew, which was beside Union Station, and the Lord Elgin was sort of notorious as a gay hangout. But eventually those places closed or shunned us, and we had to find our own spaces. So the first gay bar was on 166B on Laurier. It was started by several of the waiters from the Lord Elgin who saw that there was a market not being met, and they appreciated and liked their clientele. The first gay-owned space was called Shades. It was nearby. The building is demolished, but it was on the other side of Laurier, opposite the public library. And it was the first gay-owned bar in Ottawa. And more bars began to open, some having short lives because perhaps of mismanagement or, well, a wide variety of reasons. Others were more successful and long-lasting. So this is kind of a map of some of the bars that I found out about. The pink dots are ones where I know the exact location and have since closed. The blue dots are ones where I know roughly where there are. There's 2 floating in the Ottawa River that I have no idea where they were. And the 3 green dots that are left are the only ones that are open. So as you can see, the bars tended to cluster either on Laurier Elgin, in the Byward Market, along the Bank Street in what's now known as the Village, and also in Hull, at the time now known as Gatineau. Hull was an interesting place. Of course, it was open till, bars were open till 3 a.m. So they tended to be a bit rowdy. Our community, we would tend to go to bars in Ottawa, maybe have a quick bite to eat, and then go across the river to the bars that were open at 3. But they were typically a bit rougher, a bit raunchier. There was, because that strip had a lot of straight bars as well. If, once you mix alcohol, some of the rowdy people that Andre talked about, that created sort of an interesting culture. Some of the more notorious ones were the Chez Henri, the Club, and some of the other ones that I list. In the 50s and 70s, specifically in Ottawa, there was a bar, the Coral Reef. This is a really weird one. It was actually in the basement of what's now the Rideau Centre parking lot. And it was this strange little door that you really had to sort of search and find. A lot of people called it the Oral Grease because it was a real dive. And it had both a men's night and then also a women's night. The Grand Hotel, which is where the Westin is now, their bar was known as sort of a gay hangout. The Honeydew, as I mentioned, and the Lord Elgin. So in the 70s to 90s, I mentioned already 166B, Centertown Pub. This one actually had been around for about 30 years. It literally just closed a few months ago. Club Polo, it closed because the managers were dealing drugs. The Edge was sort of known as the bar that was attractive to youth, and it was sort of a nightclub. Frankie's on Frank had male strippers. Icon was a very popular one. It's now the Youth Services Bureau Men's Emergency Shelter. And Shades and Tactics is where the Capitol Music Hall is now. So what's left? Bars are closing as younger generations feel comfortable in bias-free spaces, as well as this proliferation of dating apps and things that are going on. So when there used to be 5 or 10 bars, giving people lots of options, now there's just 3. There's the Lookout, which is in the Market on York Street, Swizzles, which is on Queen, and it's considered bias-free, and Tea's Pub just opened effectively to replace Centertown Pub, which just closed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about rabble-rousing or community activism. The queer community began demanding rights in 1971, a couple years after the Stonewall riots, which probably most of you have heard of. And also 1969 was the year the Canadian Criminal Code was changed to decriminalize gay sex. So before that, obviously you would not feel very comfortable being politically active if you knew you could be arrested just for being out as a gay person. So soon after what's called the We Demand protest, which this photograph behind is a picture taken at that demonstration. It was on August 28, 71 at Parliament Hill. A group of some of the men who attended that meeting created a group called Gays of Ottawa. So this is a map of some of the locations of the Go Centre. It moved for many reasons over the years, and as the community sort of began to expand into and add more letters into the LGBT alphabet, it changed names eventually to the Association of Lesbians, Gays, and Bisexuals of Ottawa to 1995 when it closed. So, as I say, it was primarily run by and for gay men initially, until lesbians began wanting to integrate within the group. Lesbians tended to be conflicted because they were dealing with both the feminist movement and their interest in that regard, in sort of women's rights, and then also their rights as LGBT people. So a group was called Lesbians of Ottawa Now, or LOON, and they were formed in 1976, but they were folded into Go, creating Algo in 1983, and then eventually Bisexuals were added in 1993. So I'm just gonna, I won't go through all of them because I know I've got a, and it's fairly deep, I'm covering a lot of things here. But there were some significant moments within the community that are sort of important to talk about. One was a vice ring case where it was basically an escort service that was investigated by the police. Some of their clients were outed in the press. One of them eventually committed suicide because of that. And the Gays of Ottawa protested the media outlets and the police for this sort of unnecessary outing. In 1976, in preparation for the Olympics, a bathhouse was raided and 27 men were charged. In October '77, there was a protest that happened in Ottawa. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of LGBT people were fired from their jobs. 2 significant cases happened that year. John Damien was a horse jockey, and Barbara Thornborough, I believe, was a corporal in the army, and they were both fired from their jobs, and that sort of created activism to support their rights. Peter Evans, who's the man pictured sort of roughly in the background, he organized the first AIDS walk in Ottawa in '83. He also became the first person who died of AIDS in '84. And then, oh, that's okay. And then, yeah, Pink Triangle Services was created in 1984. They provide social services. Our first Pride picnic, we didn't have parades for a few years. We just had a picnic in Strathcona Park. The first one is in '85. And then a bunch of various organizations came in. We had the AIDS Quilt come to Ottawa in 1989. The first parade itself was in 1989. There were 300 people estimated to attend that. The hate crimes that I mentioned before, that finally led to what's called the LGBT Police Liaison Committee. And then we began working for civil and equal marriage. In 2011, I was one of several people who were lobbying to create a village on Bank Street, which now exists and is official, from Nepean to James. And in August of 2015, we had a rainbow crosswalk installed. Some of you have probably walked on it. So in wrapping up, although kind of where we are now in our community, the LGBT youth are typically confident. They're coming out at earlier and earlier ages, but they're often sort of coming out to what exactly? Because spaces are beginning to close. So what I'm hearing from youth is they feel that while they feel that spaces perhaps are less relevant, they're also feeling isolated, which is interesting because that's what I've been hearing when I'm interviewing some of the leaders of the movement from the 60s and 70s. So work still needs to be done to preserve our spaces, or either to create new ones to reflect what our community needs now. That's it. Anyone have any questions at all? I know I have a lot. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. It's really lovely to see this alternative history being reconstructed. And I see some of your sources here, but I mean, part of the trick of reconstructing the alternative histories is that what we consider proper documentation or archives don't necessarily exist because they were published. A lot of it was underground. So what kind of are you relying on oral histories and other kind of documentation?
Sure, yeah. I mean, when I was first brought on for the project, I did research in a number of places. There is a lesbian and gay archives in Toronto. The City of Ottawa Archives does have some material. It's not the easiest to access because it's not as well cataloged, so I've had to kind of rely on instinct and such to find things. Extra was a paper that is still, it's now gone completely online, but it's in Toronto. They used to have a paper here in Ottawa called Capital Extra. So they were a tremendous amount of help in resourcing, finding some of the images, as well as some of the information. The Gays of Ottawa also created a publication before called Go Info, and the National Archives, National Library and Archives in Ottawa carries a complete collection of their publication. So there is a lot of written history. I'm also now kind of in the process of interviewing people. So part of the app that I'm building will incorporate a lot of the interviews of people that I'm talking to, because I think what's interesting for people is to get their personal stories. You know, I can have a presentation like this, which is somewhat dry and, you know, with text, but if people can talk about it, it'll be more engaging for people.
Any more questions? We have a few minutes.
Oh, sure.
One of the things I've run into is, well, much of this is fairly recent history, so has it stood the test of time as we tend to think of heritage being, and for a community that has just in the last few decades begun to recognize itself. And then there's things that are like in Windsor, we have the home of the lesbian couple that whose names were first on the provincial lawsuit on marriage. And that kind of thing, it was already on the Heritage Register as somebody who had bought it back in lived there in the 1920s, and they happened to be the owners of that house. So that kind of, where do we go with this, with recognition? What are the kinds of things that the both the LGBT people and the public municipal history kinds of things can do to, I mean, Ottawa's doing this big project, but what about smaller places that there's not any official procedures? How do you get there?
Well, I mean, we are, this is funded through the City of Ottawa, as you mentioned. So we are looking at having like plaques and banners and things that will actually be in the streetscape, so it will make it more accessible for people to access the history. And you know, I think that what I've been focusing on really is sort of the early part of the liberation movement, sort of in the 70s and 80s. As I sort of mentioned at the end, I think youth and like people, younger people who are coming up now, like I'm not sure if they have a sense of community in the same sense that perhaps people did in the early part of the movement. And I think part of that problem is our community has sort of relied in the past on intergenerational passing on stories and legacy. But with the AIDS epidemic, that sort of cut a bit of that short and made it more difficult. And there seems to be more of a disconnect between older generations and newer ones. So I think that history hasn't been passed on. And so it's important for those generations to pass on the history, but also for the youth to be informing us what their community needs now. Because the changes in our community have been so rapid, so fast, that I don't think we've caught up to those changes yet. Yeah, hi.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you whether there are any examples from elsewhere across Canada, perhaps, of cities where local institutions have put on exhibits or done something to popularize information about the history of the gay and lesbian movement. Because I know that in this city that hasn't happened yet. There has been no, exhibit at the Bytown Museum or anywhere else. But I'm just wondering whether that kind of thing has occurred elsewhere in the country that you're aware of.
I can't cite any particular examples, although I do know that it is happening. I think that, because we're sort of going through maybe like a second generation of growth within this movement, we're starting to take a lot more interest in researching our history, maybe in part because some of those early activists may not be around much longer, and we want to sort of capture those stories and histories before they're lost completely. But certainly there have been a lot of documentaries, mostly in the States, although I do know a woman by the name of Nancy Nickel who has produced a number of documentaries, and so there is that information that's available for sure. Hi.
Hi, if I can just add to that, I'm with the Ontario Heritage Trust. We worked with the University of Toronto a couple of years ago to put up a provincial plaque to sexual diversity activism at the University of Toronto. And that started a collection of materials which is held at the University of Toronto. I think there are other things like that that are starting to happen to recognize that activism movement that caused change too. At the beginning, at least, of the change that we're talking about here.
Right.
So congratulations on your inventory, and I'm looking forward to the app.
Oh, thank you. Well, hopefully will be engaging for people, for sure. It's certainly, as I'm talking to people, it's really fascinating, some of the stories. The man that I pointed out, who was at the We Demand protest, his name is Charlie Hill. And he's sort of considered one of the grandfathers of the movement. And I've interviewed him, and he told me a story about him, I don't know, well, I guess he's comfortable with it because he said it in the interview. But he was entrapped by someone when he was trying to cruise, but way back in the day. So, you know, these kind of stories are fascinating to kind of hear because it puts into perspective like how prevalent that sort of stuff was happening. Yeah. I think there was one other question towards the back. Yeah, hi.
Mine's a very lowbrow question,
Okay.
not about heritage. What about that queer machine? How is that
Yes.
supposed to work?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, it